Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again. Today, we are very honored to have invited Professor Henry Rowen, Senior Fellow of the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, to speak on the predictable political consequences of China's economic development. First of all, may I invite Professor Rowen Xie now, Vice Chancellor of the Chinese University, to give a welcoming address. Professor Lau, please.
Professor Rowen, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon to you all, and welcome to the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Today, we are most honored and privileged to have with us as our distinguished speaker, Professor Henry Rowen, Senior Fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and co-director of the Stanford Project on Regions of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and Professor Emeritus of Public Policy and Management at Stanford's Graduate School of Business, and also a former colleague of mine. So welcome. Professor Rowen is in Hong Kong for 4 days only, and we are most grateful that he has come to our campus this afternoon to share with us his wisdom and scholarly insights at this public lecture. Born in Boston, Professor Rowen completed his undergraduate studies at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and received his master's degree in economics from the University of Oxford. He has held many government jobs on and off since 1961, mostly in the Defense Department. In between, he worked at the Rand Corporation, the famous West Coast think tank, where he ultimately became president in 1967. He joined Stanford University as professor of public management in 1972 and was appointed to the Edward B. Russ Professorship of Public Policy and Management in 1986. He retired in 1995, but has continued to conduct research at the university. His current research focuses on economic growth prospects for the developing world, political and economic changes in East Asia, and the tenets of federalism. He has published extensively on international security, economic development, and high-tech industries. Over the past 4 decades, Professor Rowen has served the U.S. government in many different capacities. He was chairman of the National Intelligence Council from 1981 to 1983, and Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs from 1989 to 1991. Between 2001 and 2004, he was a member of the Secretary of Defense Policy Advisory Board. He chaired the Department of Energy's task force on the future of science programs between 2002 and 2003, and until last year, he was also a member of the Presidential Commission on Intelligence of the United States regarding weapons of mass destruction. An expert on international security, economic development, innovation and entrepreneurship, Asian economics and politics, as well as U.S. institutions and economic performance, Professor Rowen is going to speak to us today on the predictable political consequences of the economic development of China. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you can't wait to be enlightened by Professor Rowen on this very intriguing topic. So please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Henry Rowen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lau, for that very nice introduction. We indeed have been colleagues, and I must say close colleagues. I very much have valued our friendship. I was thinking how to phrase it. Stanford suffered a considerable loss when you left, and Chinese University, I'm sure, got a great gain. So how to phrase this? World utility went up. Because I'm sure you're doing great good here. And maybe overall, it's a net good thing that you're here. Well, this is my topic. And I believe this audience will agree that this topic is of enormous importance to the world, and I do recommend and I welcome the opportunity to speak out at this important institution. I've recently taken a look at a prediction of mine made about exactly 10 years ago that China would enter the ranks of the at least somewhat democratic nations by the year 2015, 2015. That was a prediction made in 1996. It was made, the basis for it was a simple observation, a simple economic projection. The observation was that the people of every country that had reached a per capita income of $7,000, that's in 1995, purchasing international dollars, purchasing power parity, had a significant set of liberties. So why not China, if and when it reached that level? And I say every country, no exceptions. When I had to make an assumption, strong, sustained economic growth, given that assumption, the magic year was 2015. And here is a figure that appeared in a journal, if you can read it, fall 1996, and you see along the bottom, per capita income 1995, PPP dollars. The vertical axis is freedom rating from 0 to 100, could be 0 to 1, I mean, it's scale of 100, taken from Freedom House, organization that rates every country every year. They do it, it does it on two scales. One is political rights and the other is civil liberties. Political rights include free and fair elections, those elected actually ruling, having competitive parties or other political groupings, and an opposition with some power, so on. And civil liberties include freedom of expression and assembly and association and religion, and a generally equitable system of rule of law. These are called, I think appropriately, the institutions of limited government. Well, Freedom House lowered its rating for China after 1989 to the bottom level and then raised it one notch in its civil freedoms category in 1997, but it's remained near the bottom in its system ever since then. So this figure, I'll just take you through it a little bit, shows the solid line is it was really the average of all countries. From the lower left side to the upper right, and you see, well, Japan is over there on the right, wealthy and pretty democratic and so on. And I put Taiwan down because it had moved up rather quite a lot over time. You see Taiwan 1973, Taiwan 84, Taiwan 95. Remember, this article was published in 1996. You see the Philippines, which was had more freedoms than its income would suggest it should have, and so on. Notice Singapore. Singapore had less freedoms for its income than one would predict. But it was into the middle group, which is called in the Freedom House terminology, so partly free. Well, way down at the lower left, a number of countries, one of which was China, which I rated at about, I don't know, $1,700, something like that, per capita, 1995. Notice the prediction, that vertical. China 2015, kind of bracketing the middle partly free category. I mean, that's what the prediction said. And I published an article that said that every other country has gotten to that level of income, which was $7,000 a year in those year dollars, had reached at least this middle stage. Why not China? So that's the past. This article actually had some impact. Hard to measure the impact of any given article, but I think a lot of people read it and said, you know, this seems reasonable at least. So I just note that. Now, I emphasize that neither then nor today do I address the particular path of Chinese events will take. I don't know enough. I don't think anybody knows enough to do that. So I'm not saying it's going to follow any particular path. I address a destination, or as you will see, a sequence of possible destinations over time, rather than particular political events. So I asked 4 questions, and there they are. And I will go through each of these 4 questions. On the first one, the economic growth prospect, it is for sustained growth with a slowdown from the level average of the last decade, partly for reasons of demography. The workforce is going to grow more slowly. And as its economic level converges on that of the leaders who expect it to slow down. Now, China faces many economic challenges. People write about these. They seem reasonable. Some of them are predictable. I've mentioned the demographic one. We know about that one. Another one I feel confident of is there's going to be a lot more spending on environmental protection, which will not be hurt growth, but it'll be good for welfare. I mean, it may affect the growth figures, but it'll be good for welfare. Some are not so predictable, such as possible international or domestic political disruptions. Basically, as far as I can tell, impossible to predict. Well, there's no guarantee that the regime will avoid or overcome this array of challenges, but I believe that these will be successfully dealt with as similar ones have been in the past. That's an assumption. So what I assume, see some figures later, the prediction later, is a per capita growth rate, I'm speaking normal exchange rate growth rate, of 7% a year, which brings per capita GDP to about $3,000, and in PPP world, a different metric, about $7,000 by 2015. After that, I assume somewhat slower growth. That's 6%, and by 2025, China would be at about $5,500 per person, which is about the level of Chile today, if you guess calibrated on that, although maybe Chile is not the biggest country that around, but that's one that's at that level. So that is it's an assumption on the prospect for growth over time. Now, what about the development democracy connection? A lot of work has been done, a lot of research has been done on the associations between development and politics worldwide. Statistical associations within a large set of countries, do that. Of course, predicting for one country, China, is another matter. But there's a lot of information that's contained in the experiences of the rest of the world. And that's what comparative studies are all about. It's looking at everyone. Now, there are 3 possible directions of causation here. Economic development leads to democracy, or democracy fosters development, or there might be a common cause of both of them. And by the way, that common cause might not be observable. Can't be sure. Or at different levels of development, maybe the forces could move one way, and then at a higher level might move the other way. There's a lot of literature on this. But I will cut through all that for today and say that the first direction, development leading sooner or later to the institutions of limited government, it's associated, by the way, with a famous sociologist named Seymour Martin Lipset, is best supported among these possibilities. I say this is not a settled matter among scholars. There's some controversy, and if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them on this matter. Of course, there are poor democracies, but there are no developed, unfree countries. Every developed country, the point I made earlier, is at least partly free, and most of them are quite free. There's an important exception here. Having a high income derived from oil, more broadly natural resources, but this basically comes down to oil, high level of oil exports, relative to the economy, size of the economy, does not make a country developed. It means it gets money, but that is not the same thing as being developed. Now, education is also an important part of this story. China's overall years of schooling in the population has not been remarkable. In the year 2000, it was below that of Thailand, below the Philippines, ahead of Indonesia and India. So it was sort of in there, in the middle. And, but efforts are underway to improve it, especially in rural areas, and a vast expansion is underway in higher education. I mean, it's really fantastic what's been happening in higher education. Now, there are many problems in education, but its growing level is a positive factor for both for development and for democracy. Remember, this is a long-term view, and if it's a fact that there are students graduating from universities who have a hard time getting a job, which some of them are, I mean, that's a problem in the short term, but in the long term, you know, this is a really positive thing all around. So overall, my reading of this literature, as I've said, well, we'll say this a little differently now, that the institutions inherited from the past do affect when growth-positive policies are adopted. But when they are adopted, and when they're consistently pursued, human and physical capital is accumulated, and this leads to the emergence of institutions of limited government. There are important exceptions in the world to these policies being consistently adopted, not yet in oil-dominated economies, I've mentioned that, nor in most Islamic countries, nor in most of sub-Saharan Africa, nor in much of Latin America. That's a lot of exceptions. But when they are adopted, then it changes things. Now, when is a relatively free China likely to emerge? Well, the Leninist requirement of comprehensively controlling society is not compatible with a modern economy. Not to relax controls risks economic stagnation and popular disaffection, while relaxing them risks eventually losing political dominance. It's a choice. Beginning with Deng Xiaoping, the party has chosen to pull back in several domains, allowing markets to function, notably, but in legal and media institutions and in other ways that affect people's lives. By now, the party increasingly sets rules while leaving much authority to local party members and to private actors. It's nominally Marxist-Leninist in ideology, but party-state capitalist in reality. An example is the share of state-owned enterprises in economic output declining from 55% in 1990 to about 25% now. The center of the party can intervene if it cares enough about any particular event, circumstance, development, but the leaders understand that their micro-control energies need to be rationed. I mean, there are negatives obviously associated with this decentralization, one of which is high environmental pollution, but the trend is indisputable. Surveys show that people have high confidence in the government. And my guess is that this legitimacy derives from three main sources. One is bringing social order after about 150 years of frequent and sometimes violent upheavals. The second is people's incomes are growing. They're not growing evenly, but they're just about everybody's better off than they used to be, including in rural areas. And there's wide approval that China is being restored to its rightful place in the world. But there are, of course, as I think everybody here knows, sources of discontent are also in ample supply: pervasive corruption, environmental degradation, growth in income inequality. But before I comment on some specific institutions, I want to make kind of three general observations. One is that growing wealth increases personal liberties. And this is something that's not always recorded in official and formal evaluations of freedoms. People have assets, more choices among goods, a greater ability to choose jobs, where to live, where to travel. Private ownership of housing, autos, businesses is becoming widespread. A second is that people are less dependent on the state. It's obviously related to that First point, the old system had costs and benefits for the individual, little choice of jobs, and low pay versus security and welfare benefits. Now one of its citizens' major life choices, work, is no longer dictated by government. And third is that people have freedom of movement. The shrinkage of the state sector, surplus labor from agriculture, the government's liberalizing policies have led over 100 million people without hukus to move to the cities. This has created social problems, but it's an important dimension of freedom. Now, several important institutions have emerged or been changed. Legal, media, and elections that are expanding personal liberties, and there are many complaints that are valid about the status of each of these institutions, but almost everything was much worse 27 years ago. I keep having to remind some of my friends who are very knowledgeable in each of these areas, saying, yes, there are problems with the legal system. Yeah, oh, sure. By the way, what was it like 27 years ago or 20 years ago? Well, it was much worse. Okay. And legal. Well, legal reform was motivated by Deng Xiaoping's drive to restore order after the Cultural Revolution, gain legitimacy, and promote China as a modern nation. Although it's far from being under the rule of law, it's come a considerable distance. And my main questions here are the extent to which legal institutions have acquired some de facto independence and how far might this go. By now, there are many laws on the books. Although often not properly observed, indeed often violated, their existence signifies important principles, while in practice, more people have legal representation in court. According to one scholar, Benjamin Liebman, lawyers bring a broadening array of lawsuits, often on behalf of the victims of wrongdoing by officials or by enterprises with strong party-state ties. But individuals use litigation to challenge government action, and in so doing, pursue party-state goals of curbing administrative wrongdoing. The courts are increasingly used by people to settle disputes with each other, with 4.3 million civil cases being brought in 2004, up 30% over 5 years. Now, it's true that many laws are ambiguous and contradictory, which enables the party to maintain its authority while allowing changes to occur. An example is the organic law on villager committees, which recognizes the authority of the elected village head but allows the local party secretary to overrule the elected leader on matters declared important. So one consequence of these ambiguities is that local officials sometimes get to pick the laws they prefer to follow. So the legal system is firmly under party control. Its members often determining court decisions. Sometimes the law is ignored. When courts, pressured by local officials, refuse to accept lawsuits over property rights, laws to protect citizens' right to counsel, the lawyers themselves are ignored when the party or local officials already decided the case. And lawyers are sometimes denied the right to speak to their clients or are even prosecuted. According to Stanley Lubman, who's an expert on Chinese law, legality will not grow unless the party state alters the allocation of power between the courts and the rest of the party state. That cannot be done without the party abandoning its dominance. He also says it's wise to be cautious about the extent to which economic development can generate legal and political reform. It's a necessary condition for such reform, but it hardly makes such reform inevitable. Critical, too, will be the extent to which institutions of Chinese civil society can grow and seek to improve protections for human rights. But I summarize this aspect by saying that with a better educated population, more complex economy, more developed legal institutions are needed. Rural unrest and pervasive corruption pressure leaders to improve the rule of law despite having to relax the party's control over society. Thus, with all of its present defects, which are large, developments in the legal arena are a positive for China's economic and political future. Next, on the media, we call this the partial freeing of the media. The jailings of journalists, newspaper closings, censorship of the internet, convey the party's determination to limit access to information deemed dangerous and to prevent people from organizing against the government. And recently, some of these freedoms have been rolled back. But nevertheless, over time, there's been a large increase in people's access to information, and I emphasize this next point, their ability to communicate with each other. That's a really new development. When you know, everybody knows, the number of newspapers and magazines has greatly expanded. There's talk radio, the internet, cell phones, much wider range of topics, much consumer-oriented material. The internet and cell phones enable news about scandals to spread within hours. Liebman sees the relaxing of media controls as part of a strategy for dealing with corruption and institutional protectionism that undermines the legitimacy and effectiveness of the party state. So it encourages a range of actors and institutions, the courts, the people's congresses, party disciplinary organs, lawyers, and the media, to supervise each other. It's a game, playing off against each other. Well, I mean, there's undoubtedly something in that. And the government tries to block, tries to influence the reporting of news, bad news, and to control its interpretation. The withholding of information on the outbreak of SARS, slowed understanding of the virus could have resulted in a worldwide pandemic. When it finally acted, it did so decisively but dangerously late. So as you know, there are now over 100 million internet users, 450 million cell phones, these big numbers, reported 30,000 sensors monitoring these communications. But with 500 million text messages being exchanged daily, the government has a serious censorship challenge. The ubiquitous cell phone is especially important, not only because it can spread, quote, unpatriotic messages, but because it can be used to organize protests, expose cover-ups, and exacerbate situations that sometimes become riotous. One Chinese citizen observes, if you talk every day online and criticize the government, they don't care, because it's just talk. But if you organize, even if it's just 3 or 4 people, that's what they crack down on. It's not speech, it's organizing. Well, here party goals are conflicted. It wants economic information to spread, doesn't object to the spread of much social information. Media are useful in ferreting out local corruption, but it tries to prohibit communications with any political coloration. Media organizations have to obey party directives, and so it has its complexities for the party. I summarize this subject by saying that an authoritarian regime that seriously pursues market reforms must relax control of information. Advances in technology with great commercial value have unwanted side effects of enabling people to become informed and to communicate on a host of non-commercial topics. The tide is raising people's access to information and their ability to reach each other. However, freedom of information and freedom of speech are yet to come as rights. Political choices, elections. The 1988 Organic Law and Villager Committees, which I've mentioned, requires that these committees be elected, popularly elected, with responsibilities in such areas as fiscal management, land allocation, education, and by the mid-1990s, or by now, even more so, 90% of the heads of committees have been elected. There are lots of questions about how fair these elections are, open, competitive, it apparently varies, but it's there as an institution. People have had a lot of experience with it by now. But as I mentioned before, there's a tension between a law that gives elected committee chairmen responsibility while saying that the local party secretary is the leader on important matters. That's hard to reconcile. One way of reconciling this is for the party secretary to run and get elected. So it puts it all in one person. And that sometimes happens, but apparently not a great deal. Well, in 1996, I expected that by now there would be elections in townships. I said I really not qualified to get into politics. I guess this illustrates that my point. I wasn't qualified to get into politics, so that was a bad prediction. Hasn't happened. A few have been tried, but the process seems stuck at the bottom. On the other hand, as people enjoy greater personal freedoms and as their demand for more voice in matters that touch them directly grows, with manifestations of social discontent, the party faces a mounting problem of governance. And if people are denied regular ways of dealing with their grievances, they'll choose irregular ways. So it'll try to ameliorate some of the causes of trouble and, if necessary, repression. The party might come to decide that the best way to deal with disorder is to empower people more, and township elections would be a plausible step. There, I said it again. In any case, it could happen. So what about its democratic prospect overall? How might events unfold? Oops. So I've said I don't really want to say anything about how the particular politics will go, but I do have in mind some, I will say something about I want to say something about the order in which liberalization occurs. Liberalizing actions, important for democracy, such as improving education, protecting property rights, building legal institutions, developing financial ones, developing a strong private sector, increasing personal liberties. The order in which these things happen is important. With these already in place, and they are being put in place in China, electoral freedoms can be extended with a better prospect of success than in their absence. So China is getting this sequence roughly right. The opposite sequence would be, oh, let's have elections, and then, let's turn to doing something about the rule of law and these other things. I want to mention an anecdote. Deng Xiaoping addressed this topic in July 1988 in a conversation with Secretary of State George Shultz. Shultz, in 1988, was the Reagan administration. And Shultz asked him about his views on Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union, and here's what the reply was from Deng. He's got it backwards. He opened the political system without a clue on the economy. The result is chaos. I did it the other way around. Beginning with agriculture, starting with agriculture, small businesses were opening up work. So now I have a demand for more of what succeeds. So Shultz asked, well, what about political opening? Deng says, that will come later. We'll start small, just as the economy. You have to be patient, but you have to get the sequence right. Which is, I think, a perfect illustration of that point I mentioned. Well, sorting through all of this, and instead of picking one year in which Freedom House will declare China to be a democracy, it seems better to estimate how electoral rights might evolve over time. This is the electoral rights, doesn't include the other category of civil rights, but the electoral rights are very important. And now, an important reason for looking at this over time is that there's inertia in the system. It takes time to develop institutions, so one really should put a time dimension in this, a very important time. Well, Robert Barrow, an economist at Harvard, in 1999 published an article in which he had done a panel study of over 100 countries, and he found that the levels of income and education and some other variables affected politics, and they did so with various lags, such that the level of political rights in one period would affect the level of political rights in a later period. I mean, things don't completely change from one period to another. There's inertia in the system. So, using that model, putting in my social inputs, which I said I just mentioned the economic ones, yields the following. There are the years. The electoral rights, you see 0 to 100. Freedom House zone has these three broad categories: not free, partly free, and free. It corresponds to kind of the bottom third, the middle third, and the top third on the. And you see, well, 2010, which is pretty close, definitely in the not free zone era. 2015, 40, so it barely gets it into the partly free. 2020, on those assumptions I've made, these are assumptions, these are not, partly free, and then 2025 kind of edges into the free area. I asked Barrow recently, is it okay just sort of thinking about these as probabilities, in a sense? And he said, yeah, you could probably think of these as sort of probabilities, subjective probabilities. In any case, in the near term, don't expect China to change very much from its present condition, but if you get off to 2015 and beyond, it's a pretty good chance. So that is of course, if you change the assumptions, you get different answers. If you change the inputs, you get different outputs. In any case, my view is that as your educational level goes up and income level goes up, the party's ability to hold off granting people rights, both the civil rights and the electoral rights, might be sustained for some years, but not for decades. It's implausible that a well-educated people with an average income of maybe, well, I mentioned Chile, I mean, that's, whatever I said that was, $7,000 or $8,000 a year in 20 years will not have, it's implausible that they won't have many electoral rights. Well, obviously, several things could go wrong. I've mentioned the possibility of an economic shortfall. The Barrow data comes from a survey of 100 countries. This is just one, China. In any case, I do not argue that China will be similar to Sweden and New Zealand. The Chinese might come up with a novel political arrangement. There's always room for something new in the world. But whatever it is, the people will have more of a say in who rules them. Question 4. What are the implications for war and peace? Well, the democratic peace hypothesis is a well-known, firmly established relationship in political science, known to political scientists, that democracies don't fight each other. There are always cases at the margin, but that's basically true. By the way, this is not to say that democracies are inherently peaceful. Just look at the United States. I mean, it seems to me it's frequently engaged in wars, but so far it's always been with non-democracies. So it doesn't violate the democratic peace hypothesis. Well, this leads to a prediction that there'll be no Sino-US or Sino-Japanese conflict after China makes the transition to democracy. However, the transition might be a problem. There's evidence that countries moving from authoritarian to democratic governance are more likely to start fights than our consolidated democracies. The evidence here is not powerful, but there's some. Because internal contest for power could cause a faction to identify or conjure up some kind of foreign problem as a means of rallying support to the faction. Well, Taiwan is the biggest worry here on this front, clearly. At least today, looking at it, it's Taiwan. But if a disaster over Taiwan is averted before the mainland becomes a democracy, the prospect for a peaceful resolution improves, in my view, because of convergence on politics across the strait. A China with a more limited government is probably necessary for a peaceful resolution of that dispute. So here are my answers to the 4 questions, which you have inferred by now, I assume. There they are. I am not suggesting that the Chinese Communist Party will be gone in 1 or 2 decades, but if it survives, probably will, it will exist in a much transformed political landscape. That's the end of my story. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Rowen, for your very insightful predictions. We are very glad that Professor Rowen has kindly agreed to take a few questions from the floor. So may I invite Professor Lawrence Lau to mediate the question and answer section, please?
Thank you very much, Harry, for that excellent talk, and thank you once again. the floor is now open for questions. The chef of mic, yes. Please identify yourself.
Yeah. Okay, Marina Torborg, Sweden, Stockholm University. I would like to ask you about the income connection to democracy, because normally you discuss that the emergence of a middle class is the most crucial factor and how income is distributed in a society. And you did not go into this Gini coefficient and the growing divide in China at all, because China discussed that if Gini coefficient is above 0.45, which it has passed now, then they have passed the critical red line. So they themselves say this leads to growing inequality and political instability. So I would like to get your comments on this. Thank you.
It's a very good question. If I had more time, I would have mentioned the growing income inequality. The literature is really not unified by any means on the importance of income distribution as it affects this topic. Some scholars have said yes, it's of importance, others have said no. So it's not at all established that a higher degree of income inequality is really very harmful to democracy. There are places where there's a lot of income inequality, as in Brazil, say, Latin America, but there are other things going on there too as well. So good question. Not so clear it's important as a factor in the general story.
Next question.
Chen Kawai from Labour Group. Professor Rowen, thank you for your insightful prediction. But one thing I want to get your advice, especially the civil society growth. You know, the civil society growth is one of the big force for the political change, especially peaceful political change in former Soviet Union. But in your presentation, you seems that you don't spend much focus on this part. How much tolerance to such kind of the emergency of civil society group in China in terms of the economic growth in the coming years?
Not sure I understood the last sentence. I thought I spent a fair amount of time on civil society. That's what the legal discussion, the media discussion, my comments on people being able to move around, having more assets, that's about civil society. But the last bit I didn't quite
Well, what
catch.
I want to say, because what we found that in the last few years, it seems that also have a big control on the civil society group in China, especially many groups also complain that they are closely monitored by the government. But if we think that the civil society group is also a big political, or a big force for the peaceful political change in a country, how much, in your prediction, how much possible of such kind civil society group can be emerged and also can be a force to the political change in the coming years?
I think he's thinking about NGOs.
Oh, NGOs. Yeah. Oh,
This is one part of the name, but
okay. Oh, that's very good. Actually, I've looked some into NGOs. I think that's a very interesting phenomenon. I think these are all enormously important. What's happening? I mean, including the development of NGOs of many, many kinds. And again, I couldn't cover it here, but I'm aware of it. It's really very positive. You might say necessary condition for a kind of desirable change. It's the basis. It's related to this sequence of liberalization for a stable outcome. To have these various institutions of civil society developing, having developed. So it's enormously important. That does not lead, and I'm not about to make any specific forecast about any one of those because I don't know enough. But in general, yes, absolutely.
Yes, please. Please identify yourself.
Good afternoon, Professor Rowen. My name is Tan, an exchange student from Singapore. I would like to hear your comment about the possibility of China moving towards the position of Singapore, where where per capita income is high, but yet the market liberalization is still relatively low?
I've given some thought to this. You know, there's it's possible that a lot of Chinese people might think that, you know, we have order, we have more prosperity, these people are doing a good job, the party, let's let them just keep on ruling the place, which is one way of describing Singapore. At least my interpretation, in one sense, is what goes on in Singapore is just that. Open economy, prosperity. Actually, the neighborhood's a little dangerous, so that's another reason for leaving the PAP in charge. And so could there be an analogy with China? And the answer is maybe. I mean, it's possible, but not forever. I mean, that's why I use this model and try. Not forever. Not forever in Singapore either, in my view.
Yes. Next question.
I'm Otto Lin, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. I'd like you to comment about something about China. It is a big country. You know, a lot of people think about China, just China, like Singapore. Certainly you look in China, there's the coastal areas, that's one China. And then the inland, there's several other Chinas there. And you're looking at the Yangtze River estuary and the Pearl River Delta and the Bohai, Bohai Wan, the Bay of Bohai. That's the Tianjin and Beijing area. So there's several regions of China we can talk about in terms of population or economic development or democracy development. My feeling is that like cities like Beijing or Shanghai or Guangzhou, these are pretty well developed. And perhaps in terms of the local elections and things like that, they might become much freer or faster to become freer than what you have indicated. But in most of the inland China, I think the situation will be different. So how do you handle China in this, in the overall situation like this? How would one region affect the other? And would this impact on your equation? So when the China's going to be free?
Well, it could. China really is a kind of unusual scale, and the income differences within it are pretty big. Actually, the rent is not as great as in China, but the income differences used to be very large within the United States. They were very big between North and South. And went on for a long time, by the way, very big difference. Not as great as, however, the extremes within China. It could be. I mean, conceivably, politics could evolve so that people along the coast have greater wealth. Maybe they'll have more political freedoms of some kind than people inland. There's too out of my department. I just don't know. It's a thought, useful thought.
Questions? Please identify yourself.
Professor Henry, thanks for your speeches. I'm a year one student of CU, the Chinese University of Hong Kong. In your speech, you said that as the development leads to the democracy, but one condition in China is that the most of the natural resources is owned by state-run companies, and in these state-run companies, the Communist Party enter the company and have large influences on the production and sales. So I just couldn't understand how this kind of development leads to democracy.
Well, it is developing. It's also true. I mean, there is real economic growth is real. I mean, there's no question about that. There's been arguments about this, but it's really true. The share that is under the direct management of the state is really shrinking. The non-state sector is really growing. quite remarkably. You say resources under state control. I'm not sure what you meant by that, but if you look at all economic activity, the state, as I mentioned, actually, the state share is going down and will continue to go down. So increasingly, it is becoming a private sector. It's capitalist. So, I mean, you look at France. Oh, I should have mentioned, I'll mention it now. There was a survey done a couple of years ago by the University of Maryland, 22 countries. One of the questions was, which is the best, do you agree that free market capitalism is the best system for organizing a society? That was the one question. Of the people queried, the one who gave the highest answer, yes, we agree, were Chinese in China, 76%. Pretty close to Americans, 74%. At the bottom were the French, 36%. Big role of the state in France. I don't know if it's more or less than it is in China, but it's, you know, but clearly France is a democracy.
Yes, please. This gentleman over here.
My name is Liu from Ministry of Foreign Affairs. My question is, what are the implications of China's economic development for international relations? Thank you.
Well, I said something about that. Peace. Peace, among democracies at least. Getting through a transition, maybe that's a problem, but then good outlook. I mean, there are quite a few democracies in Asia already. So that democratic peace hypothesis is very pertinent. So it's a very encouraging prospect, I think.
I think for those of you who are not familiar with the democratic peace hypothesis, it simply means the following, that no democracy will fight a war with another true democracy. I think that's basically why, you know, never have. So that's the fundamental hypothesis. Question over here.
Thank you, Professor. I want to mention the situation in Taiwan. Politicians there are consuming a lot of social resources, but they are doing anything but they're doing nothing but elections every day. They will produce conflicts by manipulating the disputed issues. I think if China adopts the democracy, there will be a chaos because China is so huge. So my question is, how can China avoid such situations? Because I think this situation is both harmful to the economic development and the peace environment. Thank you.
Nobody ever said that democracy, I mean, nobody could reasonably say that democracies have to be neat and tidy. They're messy. A lot of them can be quite messy. And it's sort of normal, actually. I mean, Taiwan to me right now looks like it's particularly messy, pretty bad. But, you know, that's sort of the way it is in democracies. That sort of goes with it. It's kind of natural in a way, not unusual to have all sorts of bickering and arguments and so on. Take a look at the U.S. if you care. I wouldn't recommend it really, but if you're interested, look at the U.S. Congress. It's pretty messy, actually.
The gentleman back there.
Dr. Wing Chang, private person from outside. Professor Rowen, I really enjoy your analysis of China's political situation or economic development. It seems to me that you are very optimistic, but you are also very cautious. Your analysis seems to indicate that China should be able to develop into a more democratic society sooner or later, or by 2025. So my question is, should we just wait until 2025 to see a more reasonable society if we are more interested in knowing or even in helping or getting more understanding of China's political development or democratization process What should we do?
My answer partly depends on who are we.
We means people mostly in Hong Kong and China who concerned about their fatherland, motherland, as a human being with no individual interest related or directly related.
Okay, well, that's a good statement, good way to put it. The reason I ask is that I think it's generally not a good idea for outsiders to tell other people how they should organize themselves. That's kind of a view I have. But if we, as you've just expressed it, there are many things that individuals can do. We had a little discussion, mention of NGOs. There's a lot of good that can be done. A lot of good can be done with education. Key element. Business is very positive effect, rising incomes. There are many, many things individuals can do. I think philanthropy is very important. Many philanthropic activity, if one has the resources, can be done, can help.
Questions? Anybody? I think you've had your chance, but maybe this gentleman over there.
Thank you. Glenn Shai from the Hong Kong America Center. Question about the rate of growth in China. Do you think there's an optimal rate of growth for China progressing towards democratic institutions? Can it grow too fast? Or is there some rate below which it risks social dysfunction? And some people say that China has to grow at a certain rate to keep ahead of chaos. On the other hand, it overheats pretty. It sounds like it's a pretty tightrope there. Did you, in the broader context of 25, 30 years, do you have a sense about China's rate of growth with regard to its progression towards democracy?
Well, I doubt that there's a tightrope. That doesn't seem plausible. Too low would be bad. Clearly, just wouldn't produce, on this model at least, the results that are there. And you can see where very, very slow growth could cause many problems. At the high end, I don't know. I mean, there are obviously problems of environmental damage associated with what is happening now. So that suggests some changes. And it could get inflation. Inflationary effects could be bad. But I basically don't accept the idea that there's some optimum rate of growth. I mean, I have no idea what it would be other than some boundary, pretty broad spectrum.
Question, I think there was a, back, Okay.
My name is Lo Feng, and I'm also a year one student in CUHK, and I'm also a business student. In fact, we are classmates. Because in this introduction, it taught me that you are doing some economic and political researches in Asia. So I want to ask you two questions, perhaps a little far from today's topic. If you think it is too far, please just ignore it. For the recent years, over the past 5 years, the relations between China and Japan has fallen to the bottom, and they blame each other. China told Japan it's your fault, and Japan told China it's your fault. So, what's your opinion? Who should be responsible for this situation? And another question: since today, in this year, some big changes has already happened. And what's your prediction on the relations between China and Japan in the future? Thank you.
You know, a typical American reaction to this sort of question is, why can't you two people get along better? You know, it's such a problem that you can't get along better. Why don't you get, look, there's so much history here, you know it very well. And there's really nothing, I mean, can I add any value in anything I say on this subject? Probably not, actually. It's actually, Americans worry about this a lot. We really do, because we see it, we understand it's pretty deep. And we wish it weren't that way. And sometimes Americans are accused, oh, you're trying to foment, get Japan to rise up. And so we're not trying to do that. We just want everything to be quiet. And so on. But it does, you know, the thing is still there. It's a big problem. And I guess I can't really help on this one.
I think one last question. You want to ask one last question? Okay, fine. Yeah.
Okay. The very last question is to you. Doesn't this, that you involve China more and more in the world and does not isolate it, will that not contribute quite much in a way to a more open society in China, in addition to even economic growth and all that?
Well, absolutely, clearly. One of the really good decisions, one attributes to Deng Xiaoping, was opening up the economy. That really meant opening up the society in many ways. Really very important. People going out, coming back. We have so many Chinese students in the United States at Stanford. Some of them go back and forth. It's terrific. Undoubtedly, it's contributing in a very substantial way to this phenomenon, this general phenomenon, and the changes in civil society that we've mentioned has to be, part of this has to be attributed to precisely that phenomenon. I should have said that actually earlier.
Well, let's give Professor Rowen a big hand. Thank you again.
Thank you, professors. As a token of appreciation, may I invite Professor Lau to present a souvenir to Professor Rowen? This is a set of 4 Love bottles, specially designed. We hope you like it, Professor Rowen.